Today we're going to talk about a recent email I received from a client that's living in the Netherlands. He said, I live abroad and I'm married to a non-resident, so a citizen of the Netherlands but not a US citizen. Can we still file a joint return? Are there any tax tips that we could look at? This is an excellent question, and one I get a lot, especially from people that are living abroad and maybe married to someone that's not a citizen, like in this situation. So we're very used to in the US where it's the common practice to file a joint return when you're married, just because you generally get a tax benefit for that, which I'll explain in a little more detail. But when you're married to a non-resident, the general rule is, and the default is, that you cannot file a joint return. What you file is a married filing separate return, and there can be some negative consequences from a tax rate perspective of filing a separate return. First of all, when you file a joint return, your marginal rate, actually it takes twice as much income as with a separate return to get into that next higher tax bracket. So that's why a joint return can be beneficial. And also there's certain exclusions and things that don't apply the same way to married filing separate returns. So with that in mind, a lot of times you want to proactively make an election to treat the non-resident person as a citizen so that you can file a joint. In this case, we do that with section 6013G. And it's a simple election that you can attach to your tax return, which is basically saying we are electing to treat my non-resident spouse as a US person for US tax purposes for this whole year. And so once you do that, they're considered a US resident and taxable just like any other US citizen. And that election is indefinite until you actually revoke it. Once you revoke the election, you can't make that election again ever unless you get written approval from the IRS, which is something that can be very difficult. So you do want to be very intentional about that election and be aware of the implications. So the benefit is that you get that beneficial tax rate. Specifically, it works and it does well when you have a non-resident spouse that's not working or earning a lot of income, because then you can get a better tax rate with the married filing joint rate. But if you're both working and earning the same amount of money, it might not be worth it. The other thing that you have to remember is once they're being taxed and treated like a US citizen or resident for tax purposes, you also have to report their worldwide income. So that means foreign bank account reports. If they own foreign corporations, foreign trusts, it can make your tax return a lot more complicated. So you really have to weigh the difference between, are you getting a better tax rate with the complications of the file? So it can work for some people and for some people it doesn't. So in this person's case, if you're liking this video, you should really check out my newsletter where I put out different tips and tricks, latest law changes that can really help you save money and save complexity if you're living or investing abroad. Just think how much you could save with the right tax advice. We would look to see, is it worth treating them as a US resident, and is that going to benefit them? If not, there are some tax planning strategies we can apply when they stay a non-resident. For example, if you, as the US citizen, own a foreign corporation, that will be considered a controlled foreign corporation if you own 100% of it. And there's all kinds of complications with that, with Subpart F and these anti-deferral rules and filing Form 5471 for a controlled foreign corporation. A way around that is if your non-resident spouse owns 50% of that business. Now it's not a controlled corporation anymore because it's 50% US person, 50% non-US. Now you still potentially have to file the Form 5471, but it goes back to the general rule of owning a corporation where you can defer the income that's earned in that foreign corporation until you take it out as a dividend. And that's a huge benefit to getting around some of these controlled foreign corporation anti-abuse or anti-deferral rules. So that's one option. The other option is having your spouse invest in the US. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the US is probably the best tax haven in the world as long as you're not a US citizen. When you're not a US citizen, you can invest in US stocks and securities, and there's no capital gains tax in the US, no tax on interest. Depending on where you live and what treaty applies, there may not even be any tax on dividends, or at least it's a very low one. It's very advantageous if you own stocks and securities in the US, you can start investing through your non-resident spouse into the US. In particular, if you live in a foreign country that is not taxing you on your worldwide income. For example, I have clients in Costa Rica that their taxation is on a territorial base. So they're not going to tax someone in Costa Rica on their non-US income, whereas some other European countries may still tax you on a worldwide basis, but we'd look at that individually. So those are two very important ways that you can potentially save tax or maybe just complexity with strategizing ownership of assets with your non-resident spouse. To sum this up, if you're married to a non-resident, the first thing we're going to look at, can you save taxes? Is it going to benefit you to treat them as a resident for U.S. tax? If not, then we look at the other options of owning certain assets and investing in the U.S. to avoid complexity and taxes in the U.S. that way. Like with most things, it depends on the facts and circumstances of the case, but there are options out there. If you're married to a non-resident alien and you live abroad and you have questions about how we can save on your taxes or reduce complexity on your tax return, find us at McGowinTax.com and reach out for a cross-border tax diagnosis today. If you're enjoying this video, please take a minute to like and subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below.